This video is a follow-up video to my most popular video I've ever made on my YouTube channel and the second most popular video of 2024. So I do know that you guys enjoy these videos that helps you avoid 7 of the biggest mistakes I always see in landscape photography. And make sure to stay around to the end where I have a bonus tip about camera screen brightness. But let's get into it. A proper exposure is one of the hardest aspects of photography for any beginners to get right. We do have several tools to get a proper exposure. You can use the histogram to see how the light information is distributed within your camera's dynamic range. If you do not know how to use a histogram, it's an absolute must for every photographer. You can also use so-called zebra stripes that, depending on the sensitivity setting, will warn you when you're about to overexpose. I use zebra stripes all the time, and if you want to know how they work, check out this video on exposure. Just be aware that not all cameras have this function. So what you absolutely do not want to rely on is the screen. It lies like the devil. You may look at your screen and think it looks good, and once you come home, the photos are vastly underexposed because you set your screen brightness too high. And vice versa if you set the screen brightness too low. Instead, learn to use the histogram and benefit from zebra stripes or other exposure warnings. And as I mentioned, stay around to get the bonus tip on screen brightness. I extremely rarely get the best photo that I think I can get of a specific scene on the first try. And I actually find it immensely satisfying seeing how I can work a scene and over a period of time improving the photo. Unless I share that process online, it can give the impression that you always get the best possible conditions when you go out to shoot. But reality is that whether you're a pro or an amateur, the persistence and tenacity of reshooting the same location with incremental improvements will obviously improve the photo that you get of that scene. And obviously many photos aren't per se better than the previous photos, but they are different. And with many different versions of the same scene, you can make a project documenting that scene over a period of time, like dividing it into seasons or even months. So make sure to return to the same location again and again. And let me know down in the comments if you have a location like that. I have several here in Denmark that I return to again and again and again. As a beginner photographer, you've probably learned that the golden hour and the blue hour, the time around sunset and sunrise, are the best times of day for landscape photography. And for good reason. The light is magical, almost ethereal at those times of day. And I personally very often seek out the light around those times of day because it usually does provide some interesting landscape photos. But I've also found that I've come to enjoy the neutral colored light, non-golden light, very much over the years. Here I'm not talking about the hard midday top light, but the neutral light, which isn't too hard that you can capture outside the golden hour. The massive benefit of this type of light is that because of its neutral color, it will not influence the original color of the landscape. I especially enjoy combining this type of light with the morning atmosphere. Morning fog can usually linger around for hours after sunrise, and that is often where I capture some of my favorite photos. Or especially during wintertime where the sun is low in the sky throughout the entire day. It's strictly speaking not golden hour light, but because the sun is still relatively low, even the direct light has a soft quality to it. In this example of an iceberg I photographed in Greenland, we were lucky to have some sea mist roll in which helps softening up the light. We still have some spots left for this year's incredible workshop to the Greenland Disco Bay and Ilulissat area. There is a link to the workshop down in the description of the video. It may be your last chance to experience Greenland before there's a McDonald's on every other street corner. And if you are at a time of year or at a latitude where the sun rises relatively high in the sky, be sure to benefit from showery days where the weather and light changes a lot. The dappled light you can get on a landscape all throughout the day in such conditions is incredible. So definitely do not underestimate the light you can get all throughout the day. I actually have an entire chapter in my brand new ebook called Landscape Light about the types of light that you can encounter and the different light that you can encounter all throughout the day and benefit from in your landscape photography. And since this is the first recording I make after I have released my brand new ebook, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you who have already got it. It's because of you I can have and do this as my job. So just thank you. It has sold way more than I hoped it would. There's also a chapter about color where, among others, discuss the benefit of photographing in neutral daylight. As with my previous 2 ebooks on composition, I've designed this with minimal text and tons of examples to get to the point fast. For landscape light, I have also included extended EXIF data with the filters I have used, whether the photo is bracketed, whether it is a panorama, a focus stack, a focal length blend, or has some kind of other edit to it. There's also a chapter about the influence of post-processing, and in the final chapter I try to summarize everything I've covered throughout the ebook. There is even a bonus chapter with some final thoughts about light, seasons, and even strategies for getting or recognizing the photos you want to make. The ebook is 251 pages and you can get it standalone or bundled up with my 2 ebooks on composition. If you aren't out whether you want it or not, you can also get the free light version and check that one out too first. There are links to everything down in the description of the video, and again a massive thank you to the hundreds and hundreds of you who have already got the ebook. When we run workshops, one of the biggest hassles I often see from the participants of that workshop is where the different functions are located in their cameras. And admittedly, cameras are getting more and more complicated as the brands are adding more and more functions to the camera. I would know, after all, I'm a Sony user. It is of course important to know your camera, but there are shortcuts for you to avoid learning where every single function in your camera menu is located, and it has saved me hours of scrolling through the menus looking for a specific function, and that's the favorites menu. Use the favorites menu to add your most used functions from the menus, and this is something I never see beginners do. Now obviously, as a beginner you may not even know which functions you're going to use the most, so no need to worry, I'm here to help too. Here's a list of the functions that I, as a landscape photographer, have added to my favorites menu. For me, the order doesn't really matter, just that my most used functions are on the first page. You can pause the video and copy my list if you want to. I use the intervalometer quite a lot. I change my screen brightness from time to time. I also want relatively fast to be able to change between the EVF and the screen and the automatic change between them and so on. Use the favorites menu, it will change your life and your relationship with your camera, I promise you. And speaking of cameras, I once broke my first Sony a7R III because I exposed it to too much salt water. It was a big bummer as I still had 10 days left of the trip, but luckily I brought my back then backup camera, the Sony a6000. Although inferior to the a7R III, and it is only having an APS-C sensor, it can attach the same lenses as my a7R III. It does come with the penalty of a smaller sensor size and thereby a crop factor of the lens, but the point being that I could use the same lenses on my backup camera as I can on my main camera. Likewise, once I was in Cornwall with Nigel and James, you may remember I forgot my main camera in the car and didn't realize before we had already done the hike. Luckily, I could use my Sony a7C, which I brought as my video camera, as a backup photo camera, because the one also uses the Sony FE lens system. I could just use my lenses on that body instead. So to conclude, be sure to have a proper gear ecosystem. Make sure your cameras, lenses, batteries, SD cards are as compatible as they can be. It doesn't matter what brand, but it is a good idea to stay within the same ecosystem. There's nothing worse than being stuck with only a wide-angle lens on one camera because you lost the battery charger to your other camera with the long lens, and you can't switch batteries because the cameras use different batteries or something to that extent. So back when I started out as a landscape photographer, I very fast learned that the best landscape photos were taken with a wide-angle lens. And wide-angle lenses can certainly deliver some incredible landscape photos. However, I'm a big proponent of not getting stuck with only one type of focal range, and I have become a huge fan of the telephoto lens for landscape photography. Not specifically for zooming in on faraway details. I actually often find those photos to be a bit flat and boring, but the long lens can certainly be used to take classic landscape photos with great depth, having a foreground, midground, and background. In this example from the Faroe Islands, you can use the telephoto lens to capture this beautiful photo of the northern coastline with the repeating shapes of the Romantic Islands. But you can also reposition yourself and introduce a foreground for added depth, drama, and storytelling. I recognized the same effect in this location from Ireland. In this specific example, I had to use the telephoto lens from the DJI Mavic 3 Pro, but nevertheless I find this to be a much more interesting landscape photograph than the sea cliffs alone without a foreground or with a wider focal length. Yes, I do realize that this is subjective, but that is just how I feel about it. And that's the thing with the perspective you can achieve with a telephoto lens, where you make it appear like the foreground and background are closer to each other. As you can see with these examples, you do not necessarily need a human in the foreground to achieve this effect. So a telephoto lens is just as much a landscape lens as a wide-angle lens is. And throughout this video, all the different photos that I've shown are photos that I've edited, and if you want to learn more about how I edit my photos, be sure to enroll in my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers. In this course, I cover all my editing techniques, from the most basic, introducing you to the programs, to advanced blending. A few examples include cleaning your photos properly, dodging and burning, editing and blending with luminosity masks, focal length blending, working with atmosphere and glow, and much more. Generally, how to make your photos pop in a realistic way while also respecting the light. By now it is 30 plus videos and more than 20 plus hours of information, so there are just loads to get into. I've also just added English subtitles to all the videos, so if you don't understand what I'm saying, you can try and read it instead. Along with my ebooks on composition and light, there is a coupon code to get $45 off the course down in the description of the video. Another thing you may actually also learn as a beginner photographer is that there are seasons where landscape photography is more attractive. You will probably learn that autumn is the best season for landscape photography, and you will probably also learn that snowy winter scenes and spring bloom are super popular and deliver some great photos. However, one of the issues I've found with thinking like this is that you somewhat put a dampener on the so-called off-seasons, especially the time between autumn, where all the leaves have fallen off the trees and you get snow, or the time between when the snow melts and spring bloom starts. Basically, when everything is just brown and dead. And admittedly, it isn't always particularly inspiring, but photographing locations that do not depend on the features that seasons provide, and by seeking out interesting atmosphere and weather, I have personally managed to not just capture some interesting photos, but actually some of my all-time favorite photos in the off-seasons. So all those seasonal features like the colorful autumn trees and spring bloom and heavy snowfall create interesting photos, do not write off the off-seasons. And putting emphasis on the light instead of the seasons is of course also something that I cover or talk about in my new ebook on light. But onto the bonus tip. So remember how I have screen brightness as one of my favorites in my camera menu. That is because I actually relatively often change the brightness of my screen. If I shoot at night, I always lower the screen brightness to the lowest. In that way, I do not blind myself at night and keep more of my night vision. However, during daytime, I have my screen brightness at maximum. Sony cameras actually have a setting called Sunny Daylight. It boosts the screen brightness quite a lot. It helps me to be able to see the screen and to compose my photos much better. It is, however, still essential that I use my histogram or my zebra stripes to control my exposure. So if you want to learn much more about editing, composition, light, or want to join a workshop, be sure to check out all the links down in the description of the video. I hope you benefited from this video. See you next time.